2022, Gervonta Tank Davis, one of the biggest stars in boxing, I would say ever, very popular, hard-hitting, knockout artist, fan favorite, took on Rolly Romero, another young, power-punching lion. This fight had everything in the presser, trash talk, bad blood, everything you can think about. It was very intriguing because you didn't know who was going to get knocked out. This was one of boxing's biggest pay-per-views of the year last year. Gervonta Tank Davis is arguably one of the most known fighters in boxing today. I would say he's top 5 in terms of popularity. Well, this fight took place at the Barclays Center in New York City, and it's claimed that the pay-per-view only sold under 200,000 buys. Being promoted by one of the biggest fighters in boxing history, Floyd Mayweather, this pay-per-view sold under 200,000 buys. We're going to put it in perspective here in a second. The number was never officially confirmed by Mayweather Promotions, but it is speculated that this number is even lower than that. People think that this pay-per-view sold under 100,000 buys. Last week, to kick off the year, DAZN put out a pay-per-view between a former FIFA YouTuber and a guy that got famous while playing Call of Duty. Yes, I'm talking about Face Temper versus KSI. The card had other influencers on there and even had a OnlyFans model on there. This pay-per-view sold 300,000 and counting. As a boxing fan, a hardcore boxing fan, and a guy that used to box, I'm asking myself, what the happened? Why are these influencers taking over boxing? Why is that boxing now? Right now, we're going to talk about where boxing went downhill, where it all started, and why is TikTok boxing these days. It's embarrassing, and I feel bad for the people that have dedicated their lives to the sport, but it is what it is. You see, to get to the bottom of this, we got to go to the beginning. Boxing is as old as civilization. There's ancient art depicting boxing to what it is today. And it started in the 19th century. It did not become prize fighting until the 20th century. So let's go into the 20th century, 1900s. This is an era where people found out that you can make money through boxing, whether that was gambling or becoming a boxer yourself. Boxing became what it is today in the 1900s. In the beginning of the 20th century, this is where what you call prize fighting became a thing in England. This travels all the way up to the United States, the biggest market in boxing. Boxing would never become as popular as it has become if it wasn't for a black dude named Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson was one of the first fighters in the early 1900s that gave boxers personality. You see, this guy was black, and there was a lot of racists around him, and they all wanted to see him get his ass. It took a while, but they never would. And Jack Johnson would troll the racists. This is what kind of led boxers to have personality of themselves. Jack Johnson reigned and became dominant for 20 years until the 1920s, when he fought Jess Willard. But his influence is huge because throughout those 20 years, like I said, he was able to give boxers personality, and people started being invested in this. And it had such a huge impact that boxing became the biggest it ever was in the 1920s. This is where we got guys like Jack Britton, Gene Tooney, Henry Greb, and Benny Leonard. During the 1920s, boxing was the biggest sport in the United States. We're talking about stadiums full of 120,000 people. That has not been repeated to this day. And this was on average. It happened all the time. Boxing became a social event. People were there to have a good time and to gamble on their fighters. All the way up to the 1930s. 1930s, boxing lost a lot of its momentum because of the Great Depression. People stopped showing up to the fights. Boxers stopped fighting because they weren't getting paid. But it also created a hardcore fan base of people that watched the sport regardless of what was happening. And hardcore fighters were still fighting. During this time, because of the hardships, we saw some of the hardest fighters ever, like Max Bauer, Henry Armstrong, Jackie Brown, Max Schmeling, Benny Luis, and obviously Joe Louis. One of the best fighters ever. The 30s was a testament to boxing's popularity. A lot of people stuck around because it was that badass of a sport. However, it wasn't like the 1920s. I would say it lost its popularity by 2/3. So the 40s come around. At the beginning of the 1940s, we start to see boxing get a big popularity boost again. We start to see Tony Zale, Joe Louis, Sugar Ray Robinson, Max Billy Conn, Jake LaMotta, I.K. Williams. But because of the war, this popularity that was starting to rebrew comes down, and boxing takes another hit in popularity. I mean, people back in the day were volunteering for war. They were getting drafted. So a lot of these fighters didn't really get to shine. So in the 30s and 40s, boxing takes a big halt in popularity. It wasn't until the 50s where it started to blow up again. Obviously, the goal was to reach 1920s level, and in the 50s we had fighters like Rocky Marciano, Archie Moore, Sugar Ray Robinson, and Floyd Patterson. This is where a lot of the immigrants started to come into America. A lot of the little towns had their own champions. The boxing was finally starting to become worldwide. People were messing with it all over the world, and because of television, a lot of the fights were being broadcast. People were able to watch the fights, and obviously the goal has always been to get to 1920s levels, and boxing was starting to do that in the 1950s. However, because of the television thing that would have made it bigger, other sports started getting more popularity, like basketball, football, soccer. So 1950s was crucial for boxing, but because of other sports, there was a cutoff where boxing would never get back to 1920s levels. So when the 60s came around, boxing was no longer America's sport. People like baseball at that point more. Boxing was never going to get the popularity it had in the 1920s. But a very special human being came out in the 1960s. Cassius Clay Muhammad Ali. Around that time is when he made his presence felt. It was around this time where he started protesting the Vietnam War, standing by Malcolm X against racism, and he became larger than life. This created characters in boxing that were larger than life, which would lead to really good things in the future. But at the time, it was very hard for the boxers that were getting drafted into war and all that. I would say boxing took another dip in popularity during the 60s. It wasn't until the 70s came around where we started seeing guys like George Foreman, Joe Frazier, and Muhammad Ali get it on in the ring. Once he was out of prison, now that we had fighters larger than life because of Muhammad Ali in the 60s, we started to see fighters that were getting millions of dollars. This is like the biggest money that boxers had seen throughout the history of the sport. We saw some of the biggest fights, the Thrilla Manila, and we can go on and on and on. The heavyweight division was crazy, so were the lighter divisions. From the 60s to the 70s, Muhammad Ali and them ruled. This led to characters larger than life in the 80s. This is where we got the Four Kings, Roberto Duran, Sugar Ray Leonard, Marvin Hagler, and Tommy Hearns. And by now, with all this history behind them, these guys were making lots of money. And boxing was becoming a very popular sport in the 80s, I would say, because in the middle of the 80s, out of nowhere, a young kid named Mike Tyson shows up and he made more money than any boxer had ever made ever. So this is like the biggest resurgence we ever seen in boxing, but it was because of these guys from the past, like Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, allowed him to become that big. And Mike Tyson did not let down. He became a threat. Everybody loved him. Boxing became huge in the 80s. Obviously, it would never become America's sport ever again because of the other sports, but this is where the closest it ever got to, which will lead into the 90s, where we saw fighters like Roy Jones Jr., Roger Mayweather, Julio Cesar Chavez. It became about the little men during this age, and boxing was still very, very relevant. Like, they sold out stadiums and had some of the biggest cards during that time. Huge for boxing as well. And ultimately, during the 90s is when like everything changed, I believe. We started to see a lot of the legends from the 70s and 80s fall. We started to see them as they got older. Brain damage, with CTE, with Parkinson's. And America's hearts, which is the largest market for boxing, started to feel indifferent. Even fights that happened at the time had like catastrophic outcomes, like Nigel Benn versus Gerald McClellan. I think in the 90s, people started to worry about the fighters a lot more than in the past. A lot of the fighters from the 70s and 80s, they were retiring broke, brain damage, broken inside, with no help. And I think a lot of this brought down boxing's popularity. They saw it as a more barbaric sport. I think boxing lost a lot of its hype that led up to those years. All of a sudden, it died because people started caring about the well-being of the fighters. We saw fighters that were screwed over by promoters, that were screwed over. The 2000s come along, a guy whose family had been by boxing comes out of nowhere. Floyd Mayweather, his uncle Jeff Mayweather, Roger Mayweather, Floyd Sr. They had all been by promoters and greedy boxing referees or whatever. This guy decides that he wants to do his career a certain way. And this means that he's going to get the right advisors, the right trainers, the right referees, the right stipulations for every fight. He's going to avoid fights here and there to make sure that his career goes his way. Mayweather came in to make the most money as possible, have the best outcome possible. So the early 2000s becomes about the Mayweather era. He went out his own way, 50-0, made the most money at any fighter ever, held on to most of it, and retired undefeated. Well, in the years to come, this motivated a lot of other fighters to do the same thing. And during this time, the early 2000s, the UFC was bought by a billionaire bunch named Zuffa. Zuffa, with Dana White in the corner, were able to buy the UFC for cheap. They made Dana White the president. And Dana White wanted to create a brand where only the elite would exist. During this time where Mayweather was doing what Mayweather does, the UFC was putting on the best fights possible. Even though it was dying at the beginning, a lot of people were converting over. Why? Because the Mayweather effect was nobody wanted to fight each other. Everybody wanted the biggest paychecks, and promoters were getting... You see, Mayweather had a lot of promoters behind him, like Leonard Ellaby, Al Heyman, who wanted the most money possible for everybody. So that means avoiding fights and fighting fighters under such stipulations. This created a culture shock in boxing that fighters were not fighting each other, they were avoiding each other, and they were waiting for the perfect moment. And sometimes that never came. A lot of these fighters were losing, so the best fights were not happening anymore. So a lot of people were getting away from boxing because they weren't putting on the best events. But the UFC was. They were using a lot of WWE tactics and putting up the best against the best. Well, this made it where it became more exciting than boxing. Well, because every once in a while a fight would happen and they would outsell every arena and every pay-per-view record. The promoters felt comfortable that boxing was always going to be better than UFC. Eventually, it wasn't. Out of nowhere, like Dana White invested in infrastructure in the company and the UFC became top dog. I mean, we're at the point where like boxers now have to wait till the UFC's over to fight. It's happened many times because it happened on the same day, and it was because boxing promoters got greedy, boxers got greedy, just literally everybody got greedy, and the best fights never happened. So now we're left with a generation of fighters who want to come up, but the viewership is not there anymore. Boxing is becoming like kickboxing. No one gives a about it anymore. So when KSI fought Joey Weller, that's where this TikTok boxing, YouTube boxing, it was two guys with huge following, and the people showed up to the fights because they wanted to see both of the guys. They're fans of both of the guys. It opened up a whole different avenue for boxing, influencer boxing. And that's where we're at now. I mean, this escalated to KSI versus Logan Paul, and it's more about the popularity that you have these days than the actual skill that you have. And I think boxing is dead, and they will never come back. You see, not only is this influencer shit taking over, but people have seen how dangerous this sport can be if you take it on full term. So I don't ever see it being the same. I think this is the last legs of like the old school boxing that we love, but this is why it became bad. It was really because of the Mayweather effect, and then boxing promotions started looking at that and wanting to repeat that. They try to make their own stars, so they avoid fights here and here and here when they're really killing the sport. Yeah, they might get some money in their pocket, but overall, long term, it's not going to withhold. That's what happened to boxing. That's why we see TikTok boxing taking over boxing. If you disagree, tell me why in the comments.